Hi, Super Milkers. I'm Christy Blanche.
I'm Jason Pierce.
And welcome to the first interview, live interview, for social issues through comic books. Sorry we had a few technical difficulties.
This should be fun.
This is our first one. We are fortunate enough to have with us Denny O'Neil, who has written the books that we are using today, Batman Venom, and Green Lantern and Green Arrow. Now, Denny's been in the comics industry since the 60s as a writer, as an editor. He's a board member of the Hero Initiative, and he's an educator. He's written for DC, Marvel, Charlton, you name it. He was born in Missouri, and he majored in English literature. He's been in the Navy. He's been in newspaper jobs. He performed a writing test for Marvel, and that started his career in comics, which we're very fortunate that he is in comics.
Very much so.
He's written, of course, Batman, and he's written one of my favorite books, The DC Guide to Writing Comics. I think it's brilliant. So everyone, welcome Denny O'Neil. Hi, Denny.
Hello, Christy. And Jason.
And Jason.
Thank you.
Well, we really appreciate you being here with us for our very first interview. So you're a guinea pig.
Okay.
So what we're going to do is we're going to ask you some questions from our students they're tweeting in questions right now, and they posted questions to the discussion board, and they read 85 and 86 of Green Lantern, and then they read Batman Venom. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure they've read a lot more of your books, but these are the two that we read for this course. Mm-hmm. So, Jason, you want to start us off with our first question?
Yeah, this question is from Michael Bast. He says, Denny, what would you do to the Green Lantern, Green Arrow issues? Would you write them any differently if you did them today?
Yeah, my concerns are basically the same as they were all those years ago. I would contrive a way to make a story out of what I consider to be a terribly broken political system. I would do stories about hunger. We did 2 stories about the environment. One of the most discouraging things about revisiting this stuff is how little progress we've made. And in the environment, it's almost discouraging to look at the nightly news, or particularly the stuff that zeroes in on the environment, because of how little progress has made. I would scream bloody murder about that in every way I can. Always remembering that my primary job is to tell a story about a melodramatic story about extravagant, larger-than-life characters. Whenever we do this so-called relevant stuff, we have to remember, if you wanted a dissertation on some problem, you'd buy the New Republic. If you buy a magazine with a picture of a mesomorphic guy in a costume, you have a right to expect a certain kind of entertainment. And we have always tried to deliver that.
That's great. So, and we're actually going to be studying environment next, so we'll request, and a lot of people have bought this volume, and those are in here, so we'll talk about those. So Alex Manfield asked, what were you hoping readers would get from your stories about social issues?
Well, I wasn't trying to give them any solutions. If I'd had solution to those problems, I might have tried to get elected to something, or galvanized the masses. But I'm not a masses galvanizer. I despise politics. I think that's the serpent in our collective genome. I was a guy who was genuinely and seriously interested in the stuff we used as themes. And it occurred to me that at whatever age I was, early 30s, I might have actually been too old to come up with what I think is the kind of creative thinking that will solve these problems if we solve them. But get a really smart 12-year-old or 15-year-old, get them growing up knowing about these problems. That might be of some use to the culture, to the world, to the survival of the race. So that's all I wanted to do. Sound a wake-up call. We never presented answers, really. We just tried to be little funny book Paul Revere's. One of the most gratifying things that happens to me occasionally is when someone says, yeah, you did that. You made me aware of these problems. Somebody who is now in their mid-30s, probably.
And how did people initially react to those stories when they came out?
Well, I think at the comic book company there were probably some scratched heads. The first article came out in a paper that I religiously read every week, The Village Voice, and it didn't mention Neil Adams or our great editor Julie Schwartz or me. And my guess is that a Village Voice reporter called the comic book company and got put through to whoever's phone wasn't busy. And that person may not have known. I doubt that Julie, at that time, had to get permission to do anything. It was a loosey-goosey business. He would not have seen the need to report to anybody up the food chain. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of puzzling, but that kind of straightened itself out. And the response was very gratifying. Boy, Neil Adams and I, just a couple of funny book geeks, were, being invited to, we were on French television, Zoutalours, and invited to universities, and or not ready for that. It had no monetary effect on our lives because there was at that time no such thing as a comic book career. I mean, there was no track that you got onto and eventually ended up in a corner office. I don't think I had a career. I had 50 years worth of interesting jobs. But so I got the same $15 a page for writing that as I got for writing Super Friends. But it did get us a lot of attention. And along about the 6th issue, we got a text page from the Republican mayor of New York City. And that was about the end of the rainbow for respectability. Whatever stigma were stuck to the comics from the witch hunts of the 50s was certainly gone when John B. Lindsay volunteered to write a text page. And it went on like that for a while, and then the series ended, and the conventional wisdom at the time was that a comic book's life was 3 months, and that every 3 years there was a complete turnover of readers. Well, Neil and I and Julie were aware that we had pushed an envelope. But so I thought this one might last a year, these issues. We did not expect them to be published in hardcover, slipcase editions 40 or 50 years down the line. I mean, these were comic books, for heaven's sake. This was birdcage liner. It was, even then, thanks to Stan and Julie reinventing superheroes, by nano inches, comics were becoming a little respectable, but it was still a pretty low rent occupation.
So George Schmitz asked, you went up against the comics code during this when you're talking about, everything that was going on in respectability. So you went up against the comics code for this issue. So was there anyone hesitant to let you run this story?
They didn't know what stories we were going to run. No, I mean, I am told that there was a smattering of nasty mail. At one point, one of the executives sent my then wife some roses. I don't think that Anne ever got any fallout, but just in case she did, they were nice enough to make that gesture. But we had very little static of any kind. As far as the code goes, well, there was that odd coincidence that Stan with Spider-Man was coming out with a drug-themed story about the same time as our two-part Green Lantern, Green Arrow. And we all had a meeting. I was there representing the freelance community. Stan decided to take the Comics Code seal off that one particular issue.
Mm-hmm.
I think Neil had to redraw part of one panel. They had a rule in the code that said you could not give detailed information on how to commit a felony. Well, there is a shot in there where Speedy is sticking a spike into his arm, and if you want to be really technical, yeah, we were showing a junkie how to shoot up. And Neil changed, I think, one shot, and didn't change the cover, which had Speedy and the needle.
Yeah.
But I don't think they quite knew what to make of it. But what they did know was suddenly comics were getting the right kind of attention. They were getting mentioned in the media respectably. By that time, the code was not a big part in our lives anymore. The code is a complicated issue. I can say I'm grateful to it for probably keeping governmental forces out of comics. I had my few run-ins with them, and I had some public kind of debates with the guy who was administering the code, who was himself not a bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
But no code stuff. Recently, a friend whom I consider to be one of the very best comic book writers told me that as a conservative, he had some problem with the cover that featured Nixon and Agnew. It never occurred to us at the time that anybody would disagree with us. I mean, to me, I thought this stuff is all so obviously problematic, but Neil has even said that there were more problems that Denny was, some of the problems were what Denny was worried about and not everybody else. And it didn't occur to me at the time. It was actually Neil's idea to put Nixon and Agnew on the cover, and I didn't have any problem with it. I didn't. By that time, my God, you know, and Nixon was on his way out of office.
Mm-hmm. So, our next question is Tom Ponce. For the Green Lantern story, why did you choose heroin?
It was the drug that was probably the biggest problem on the streets of New York. I lived in an unsavory neighborhood. As one of my friends said, there were either a lot of diabetics or a lot of junkies on our street because there were a lot of needles. For obvious reasons, I didn't want to do grass. I didn't know anything about cocaine. Heroin was the drug that I knew was a problem on the streets of New York. Of course, the other big problem was alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And we did refer to that. Earlier you asked, what would I change? I would jump on the alcohol problem with both feet if I were to do those stories today.
Yeah, that was actually one of our questions was if you wrote this today, would you use the same drug? Would you use...
Oh, today you'd have to use crack.
Yeah, or meth.
Neil,
if that's different, I don't know.
Oh, yeah, that's truly awful stuff.
Yeah.
I tried it once when I needed to. I had been up all night. I had to give a speech at some distant city, so I asked somebody if they had something that would just keep me awake till noon. 3 days later, I'm still talking.
That's awesome.
I mean, I'm a recovered addict, so this stuff cuts very close to the bone, and I might as well joke about it. It's not in any way a funny topic.
Yeah. So,
Well,
Jason?
is following up on that, your addictions, was that what pushed you to tell these stories and get them out? Was that a motivation?
Well, who knows what happened subconsciously? I don't think I was calling myself an alcoholic. I don't think anybody was, you know. I don't think if my parents were alive, they would not be calling me an alcoholic. Isn't it nice that Denny had got over his problem, they would say. You know, the problem I was passing out every night. So I think underneath, below the surface, I was aware that I had a problem. But I don't think that had anything directly to do with the plotting of that story, because we were writing about heroin, and that really was a terrible problem on the streets of New York. We didn't do a lot of research for these things, but Neil and I did spend a day or two talking to rehab people in what were primarily heroin clinics. And it was pretty grim. It's still pretty grim. But now they have, well, often different drugs. Not any better, but different.
So, you not only Green Lantern, but you also wrote about addiction in Batman Venom, which is another story that we read. So, both A. Miller and Jeff Whitman wrote in. They have about the same question about when writing Batman Venom, were you specifically concerned with portraying drug addiction and recovery differently from when you wrote Green Lantern?
Sure. The genesis of Venom was what, you know, everybody who's danced this dance knows. You don't take your first drink or snort your first line of cocaine thinking, well, I have just started to ruin my life. I have just destroyed everything that I love and believe in, and maybe my life in the process. Whee! What you do is, for me, the first drink was a boon. I was an introverted, 130-pound kid who hugged the wall a lot, and it enabled me to talk to girls, to have a social life, to have adventures that I would not have had otherwise. I think people who use other kinds of drugs would tell a similar story. It feels good at first, and then somewhere in there, a corner's turn. You don't know when you've turned the corner. And it's probably not, the denial problem is probably not as bad now, but back then, you know, people were reluctant to say alcoholic. And you could certainly make excuses for yourself. You could rationalize. Well, yeah, this occasionally gets in the way of things, but it'd be worse for me if I wasn't taking this. That was one of my favorites. Didn't ever feel like putting that to the test, but that was an excuse I could make to keep doing what I knew by then was very destructive. Now I am drinking tea, white tea at that.
Wow, that's great.
In both Batman and Green Lantern, Green Arrow, do you think showing a superhero addicted to drugs diminishes the super from the superhero, or does it make them stronger?
That's from Hiran Vasquez.
Well, I've heard that before. It's first cousin to the question of why put this stuff in comic books? We buy comic books to escape from social problems. Uh, my answer is that unflawed. Well, it's a complex question, but unflawed heroes are pretty damn boring. That's something that Stan Lee brought to the party in about 1959 or 1960. Coming off the witch hunts of the early 50s, comic book heroes were indistinguishable, simple grammatical sentences. You told them apart by their powers. Hawkman was the one who flies. Flash could run fast. They didn't have much personalities. At best, what actors call funny hat characterization. Some dress peculiarity, something like that. So you don't want, well, forgive me for insulting any goody two-shoes in the audience, but you don't want goody two-shoes heroes just because they're boring. That said, we chose a costume character deliberately because we wanted to say that nobody is immune to this problem by virtue of their station in life. And particularly if we're talking about a teenager, who in real life that kid would have probably had problems with his stepfather. Mm-hmm. And second, we wanted to tell as strong a story as we could. All right, we could have done a Star Trek and had the ensign, you know, character who beams down to get killed before the first commercial. I could have made up some friend of Speedy's to get killed, and it would have had almost no emotional impact. See, Speedy was never a major character, but for God's sake, he'd been around since 1940. If you knew comics, you probably knew him and had some dim, distant emotional reaction to it. We had to make it a continuing character. Mm-hmm. We had to make it a character who could logically be ignored or mishandled by one of our main heroes to show that that's a problem. And I gave Black Canary the job of being the sympathetic nurturer. So for all of those reasons, I thought at the time, and I still think, that Speedy was a good choice to serve that plot need. That's what he was doing. We had a plot problem. He solved it for us.
Well, and even Green Lantern was he was much more sympathetic than Green Arrow.
Yeah. I don't see Green Arrow getting emotionally involved with anything the way Ollie would. Ollie is one of those guys who is just tremendously emotional, and he uses, in real life, people use that as fuel to get things done. Mm-hmm. There are people who get things done by being calm and thoughtful, and that would have been closer to Hal Jordan.
Yeah. So Wendy Whipple, who I actually met in person, that's kind of cool. Do you think
great name, Wendy?
Yeah, I know,
Whipple.
Isn't it a great name? She could be a superhero, Wendy Whipple. So she asked, do you think that popular media like comics have a responsibility to address social issues and to start people talking about these things?
Nope.
No.
I think comics have a responsibility to tell stories. It is a narrative form. It is, and at the end of the day, storytelling is probably more crucial to who we are as human beings than any social problem. So I do think one or two of our current social problems might spell the end if we don't get our act together. But storytelling is very deep and very essential to what makes us human beings. You buy a work of fiction, whether it's a comic book or something by James Joyce, and you buy that to experience a story. We don't give them that, and we've cheated them. We do give them that, and we've done our job. That doesn't mean that comics can't add on to that, which is what we tried to do with Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and occasionally with Batman. But if we've told them a story, they've gotten their money's worth. And then there's the problem, a lot of people disagree. Even today, I think that problems with the environment are written in neon letters as big as Mount Rushmore, but there are people who I think honestly believe that global warming is just one of them, things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we're actually, like I said, we're going to tackle environment, and because it is one of those things, I think that maybe comics don't have a responsibility to get people talking.
But since it's such a prevalent issue, it gets covered.
I think, yeah, and it's part of life, and comics really are reflecting what's happening in our culture.
And the other answer to that is this what comic books should do? Well, comic books should do anything comic books can do. Mm-hmm. You have to keep breaking the old rules, and you have to keep pushing the boundaries. Comics that are surrounding me at the moment are vastly different than the ones I read when I was 6. And the ones that I read when I was 6 were perfectly good for what they were. But it has to change or it dies. I'm sorry for all the creationists out there, but evolution is one of those facts of life.
I would clap if it didn't. Wouldn't be too loud.
We have a question from Matthew Wood. He says, you mentioned people sort of looking over alcohol back in the day. Do you think that people would feel similarly today about shopping addiction or food addiction, or would they trivialize the word addiction? And he goes on to ask, what if, like, Robin couldn't stop exercising?
Well, those are valid problems, but the other thing to think about when you're doing these kind of stories is what is possible to the medium you're working in. The economy is a horrible problem. I don't know of any way to encapsulate that in fantasy melodrama. Yeah, food addiction is a terrible problem. And what is it? 2/3 of us are obese or badly overweight. Mm-hmm. It would be hard for me to create a melodramatic fantasy story around that. I'm not saying it can't be done. I would have problems doing it. I don't know how I would approach that. Same way with a lot of the other addictions. And it's like, well, there's the same reason there are so many cop shows and lawyer shows on television. If you really want to engage people, you have to, on one level or another, deal either in comedy or in really serious situations. So with cops and with lawyers, it's built into who they are, that they will deal with serious life and death situations as part of their job, so you don't have to contrive a reason, as Hitchcock did with many of his movies, to get them involved in this dire thing. Well, it's when you're doing the kind of heroic fiction that we did, it has to be a big problem and one that people can immediately or close to immediately identify as a serious problem. So over-exercise, well, come on, that's not the major problem in the U.S. today. It's the opposite, that people don't move enough.
Mm-hmm.
Whoppers, that's the problem.
Whoppers.
Yeah, and commercial, if you watch television, you're being told, clog your arteries, all night long.
Oh, that's great.
I had a heart attack 12 years ago, so this too is cutting close to the bone. And Mary Frances had a stroke, so we are both people who drink white tea instead of Coca-Cola.
Yeah. But you're drinking black tea, though, right?
No, I'm drinking white tea.
Oh, white tea. That's the good
Well,
stuff.
I'm an Irish kid from St. Louis. I mean, you know, I'm not a racist, but
Oh, so uh, between, do you think that making Batman addicted to drugs and showing that this can happen to even somebody as strong as he is, do you think that has more impact than if you just had him saving somebody on drugs?
yeah, sure, because it's the Starship Ensign syndrome again.
Yeah, that's true.
To tell that story effectively, it had to be Batman. It had to be somebody who you know to be strong and admirable and who did it for what he thought was the right reason. I'm never going to let another kid drown because I can't lift 5 more pounds than I'm lifting. From a dramatic standpoint, it's good melodrama, and that's, at the end of the day, the business we're in. From you know, people who they are still out there who say, you know, all these alcoholics and drug addicts, all they need to do is kind of slap themselves, you know, just get their act together. I wanted to say no. You do it for the right reason, and eventually, if you have the right genetic makeup, it'll grab you, and it'll start strangling you.
Mm-hmm.
There is, I mean, it's a complicated problem, but there is a genetic aspect to it that we can't ignore. I don't think I was aware of that when I wrote the GLGA stories.
Well, I think that recently the genetic idea of genetics being so strong in people with addiction has just, it's really, it's still not accepted by everyone, but it's really being shown that there are genes, not just one gene, but there's a series of genes that do promote addiction. It doesn't mean that if you have that, you're going to be addicted. You are just prone to be addicted more easily.
And then given the right environmental and familial influences and social influences, you are likely to turn that corner.
Exactly.
It's a kind of has to be a conflation of nurture and nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another question. Rodney Traham said, through your travels to conventions, the classes that you give, have people come to you and thanked you personally for these stories?
Yeah, they have, and that's an enormously grateful moment in my life.
Does that make you, for any backlash that you got from these comics, does that make you make up for it?
Oh, a million times, yeah. The only danger is to take it too seriously, because if I start writing a comic book tomorrow, none of that will make any difference. Each one is a set of problems you have to solve.
Yeah.
And it's a very good idea to keep in mind, to have a Zen attitude toward it. You owe the task and you owe the audience your very best effort. But if this story doesn't get written, civilization will not collapse. Dick Giordano used to say, we have to remember we're not curing cancer. I just think that's a healthy attitude, because if you think, well, I am an author, and Ernest Hemingway was an author, and William Shakespeare was an author, that's an awful lot of baggage to carry. No, it's a job. It is the early guys, Mike Uslan, who's been the producer on, I guess, all of the Batman movies, or one of the producers since 1988. And he was a guy in New Jersey loving comics and realized I could go across the Hudson River and talk to these people. So as a kid, he interviewed the guys who were, you know, creating the comics back then, and he said that all of them said it's a job. It's a good job. That's kind of the way I think of it. I can't imagine a better job for the last 15 years that I did it, given who I am and what my limitations are, than being the Batman editor. It was the best job on earth. But I did have to meet those deadlines, and I did have to do that paperwork.
Yeah.
Let's see. Kelly, I'm going to butcher the last name.
Ribeiro.
Ask, Batman and Speedy overcame addiction by themselves. Does it reflect on your personal belief on how addiction should be dealt with?
No, you got to get help. I mean, that doesn't mean that it's not possible, but it's very dangerous to go down that path. To think, well, I can just tough this out. Mostly you can't.
I feel like in Venom, I feel like Alfred in Venom was a big contributing factor to Batman kind of realizing, oh, I've like went too far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That Alfred started off as bad comic relief and morphed in over years into one of the best comic book characters there is. But yeah, if two old friends, one of whom is a mystery writer who I once tore it loose and got good and drunk in Greenwich Village with, had not invited me to breakfast and then said, hey, we're going to a meeting a couple of blocks from here, why don't you come along? And did the, I don't know, that was a kickstart. I had to do a lot of it by myself, but without those two people and that morning, who knows? I knew by then I had to stop drinking, but it's really tough.
So if this is too personal, just tell me to hush. But for your addiction, did you get help?
Yeah. I'm being careful because I don't want to say something I shouldn't say, but I did the therapy that you always hear about, the 12-step therapy. And I did 90 meetings in 90 days. And I was lucky in that I was living a short walk from Greenwich Village, and those meetings were full of writers and artists. Well, I mean, that's where people lived. And it did this, too. I knew that at 11:45, I was going to leave my apartment in Soho and walk over to the village. And then I was going to go to a meeting, and I was probably going to go to lunch afterward. I was freelance at the time. That gave a structure to my day. And it's very useful for a lush or a junkie to have a place to stand. Especially if you're freelance, there's no structure imposed from outside. That kind of serves that need. That isn't something they ever talk about, but it's something I found useful. And if you need help, it's a phone call away. You don't ever have to be alone, which is another big problem. I was, divorced and living by myself. And despite the fact that there were 8 million people on that island, it can be a pretty miserable existence. So that was another way to take care of it. Yay for the 12 steps.
Yay. Okay.
Bo Snow via Twitter asked, if you were to do an addiction story today, who would be the most apt character to tackle the issue, in your opinion?
The question? Maybe? I don't know.
Oh. That would be a good one.
I still like Batman, though, really, because he's so strong-willed. And for him to go down that path.
Well, and that leads to the next question. Justin Parmenter said, what made you decide to adopt a darker tone for your Batman, imagery? What was it difficult to write that change when he had a certain set of moral standards and then to put him on drugs?
Well, what moral standards? I mean, my involvement with Batman began when the TV show was suddenly went from being required reading for every hipster in the country who no place to go, nothing to do. And the comics had been kind of following the campy lead of the TV show. I don't think comic book guys had any interest in camp or any, their sensibilities were contrary to it. But they tried to do it, and that went away, and at that point, Neil and I were flavors of the week, and we were asked if we'd like to give it a shot. But that was at the point where characterization was just beginning to be a factor in comics. Most of the stories were plot-driven, and the first Batman story was 6 pages long. It was adapted from a novel, shadow novel. I don't think that's a secret anymore. But it was plot-driven. The characterization was not only in comics, but in the radio shows and a lot of the B-movies at the time. It was whatever you could be approved of. The characterization would have been what will not offend any fundamentalist in any small town in South Carolina. They didn't want to raise hackles. They didn't think much, as far as I can tell, in terms of character. Many of them were refugees from the pulps, and the pulps stories were character-driven. The guy who wrote The Shadow and was a remarkable and an underrated contributor to our mass culture. But one of his other jobs was magician. First time I met him, he did a torn and restored napkin trick for me. And he thought in that way. The gimmicks, how is this going to work? I wish actually there were more of it. Sometimes I'm watching a television show and think, okay, how did they know that's where the bad guy was going to be?
We have, kind of going back to your comment on the question, we have Esther E. Alperin, hi Esther, asked to look back on your run of the question, and with Mr. O, is there anything you would have changed in regard to his later stories?
Nope. Well, that was a blessed time for me. It was the reason I did the question was I had been editing at DC for 6 months. I was walking back from dinner with the Paul Levitz, who was at the time the vice president in charge of publishing, and one of his jobs was to take care of making a profit. And he said, "Are you going to start writing?" I guess I was hired as a hyphenate, writer-editor, as was Archie Goodwin. And what was available was The Question and Captain Atom, both of which had been acquired in some kind of deal from Charlton Comics. Mm-hmm. Captain Atom was another iteration on Superman, and I am not comfortable writing God characters. There are people who do it very well. I just don't happen to be one of them. But the problem with The Question was I have respect for Steve Ditko. I like him. I would love to work with him again, but politically we're at opposite ends of the earth. And I could not in conscience do his Question. I liked the idea of the character. I could not, even putting on my hack hat, I could not bring myself to write stories that Ayn Rand might have enjoyed. So they said, change it. And I was sharing an office with the editor. I had 6 months preparation, unheard of in comic books, or in my life as a professional writer. I mean, usually if you're doing a novel and you get 6 months, that's pretty good. So I had more freedom than I ever had doing comics, and I can't think of anything I've ever done, except maybe short stories that are published in obscure magazines, where I had that much freedom. We felt our way. I changed a few things going in. I said no sound effects and no transitional captions. No sound effects because they're easy to satirize. They're what the Batman TV show got a lot of mileage, humor mileage out of.
Yeah.
And no transitional captions because at a point, if you've written 600 or 700 stories, you know how to do it. And it's pretty easy to go on automatic pilot. Well, one of my fallback devices, my rosy-fingered dawn, was transitional captions. So I gave myself the task of doing without them, and we'll see what happens. But given that much freedom, what on earth could I have possibly complained about? I wrote about stuff I was really concerned about, and somewhere in the middle of that came the whole blow-up about should we label comic books, with a lot of our libertarian colleagues against it. Well, there are two stories in the question, the first 36 I did, that I'm not sure I would. I mean, my kid was raised in Greenwich Village. There was very little he hadn't seen by the time he was 8 or 9. I'm not sure I would have wanted him to read those stories, not because of sex or violence, but because they dealt with father-son stuff. And I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have wanted his Missouri cousins to read them. So I had the freedom to write that kind of thing if I wanted to write it. I did think we should send a warning signal up. I don't remember how that played out. But when we did The Killing Joke, a Batman story by Alan Moore, it was the first thing I edited when I took over the Batman line. And that was pretty heavy stuff for a kid. We were very stupid. We thought the price point is going to keep it out of the hands of kids, not thinking, yeah, that is, like a 6-year-old isn't going to be able to buy this, but his grandmother is. And his grandmother thinks Batman is that thing on Saturday morning television. So I got some phone calls that broke my heart. I'm not in the business of giving kids nightmares. I would go a long, long way not to do that. But with the question, we took it reasonably easy on the sex and the sex. There was an adult relationship, but as far as I was concerned, if you're an adult, you don't need to see that spelled out in a panel. But I would have wanted those two stories I'm talking about. I want parents to look at this stuff. As I said, what my own son would not have noticed as anything to notice when he was 8 years old reading a comic book would have perhaps disturbed his cousins. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is not the comic book writers or the magazine publishers' business to deal with that. It's the parents. Now, with my own kid, when I was reviewing movies for Archie Goodwin, I would take my kid to anything I was going to see. Some of it was pretty ugly, some of it was pretty violent. When he was a teenager, he said some of it gave him nightmares. I thought, this kid grew up in Greenwich Village. He's seen actors and movies and musicians. His father writes these damn stories. He hears the typewriter going to sleep every night. He knows that it's all phony. I underestimated the power of imagery, in effect. Mm-hmm. Pretty dumb for a writer to do. And but that was not the people who made those movies' problem. It was mine.
I'm going to go back to the Killing Joke for just a second. I just was lucky enough to hang out with Brian Bolland this last weekend, and super cool guy. And we talked a lot about the end of the Killing Joke, because when it came out, people are reading it, and Batman didn't really kill, so it wasn't even a question at the end. You know, Joker was just taken off. But then like a year ago, I guess, Grant Morrison came out and said, no, Batman killed him at the end. So...
which seems so obvious now. But reading it at the time...
But what was the feeling then when that story came out?
The feeling was... It's pretty heavy stuff, and it had been in the house for a while before I took that job. And as I said, that was my first experience with an Alan Grant script, which is a trip in itself. It's like, you know, 2 single-space pages. That's panel 1, and um, so I read it and told the powers that be, we either kill this, give him a kill fee, or I send it to the artist. I am not going to presume to soften this. We're either in the business of telling good stories or we're in some other business. If we're in the business of telling good stories, we do what Alan wrote. If we're not, okay, we can live with that. But I think it was admired at the time. I don't remember any fireworks going off because of it. We knew it was a damn good story. I think anybody who looks at it can respond to what's there. You may not like it. You may think it's too violent and too ugly. That's a separate discussion. But whatever it is, it's well done. You guys are frozen. Are you still hearing me?
No, we're here. Yeah.
Okay.
I think we were just really still. We were anticipating. I'm going to ask you this.
I was captivated.
You can answer it or not. What do you think those last panels meant? Do you think he killed him?
No, I don't. But you can argue it, I guess, either way. One of the jobs of an editor is to delineate the ballpark. One of the things that makes Batman wonderful to work with is he's a great storytelling tool in the way that The Spirit was a great storytelling tool for Will Eisner. And the rules I set down were sort of these. No science fiction, sci-fi light, the kind of stories that were told in the 50s. And no girlfriends, because for me it's better drama if he is so devoted to what he does that he gives up a normal life. And no killing, because first of all, that's a slippery slope. You kill once and it 3 issues away. That's the logical plot. I'm kind of against killing. I think there's even police have usually perfect justification for the violence they use, but that doesn't mean we have to approve of it. I especially don't approve of, yay, I just killed somebody. Buddha said that there are times when violence is necessary. If you need to save your life or save somebody else's life, you do what's necessary, but you do not like it. You do not rejoice in hurting other people. So for that reason, and for the psychological reason, he's Batman because of 2 horrible acts of violence. That would give him a psychological barrier to overcome if he ever wanted to really hurt somebody. So for those reasons, I would say no. In my private Batman cosmos, no, is not killed.
I'm about ready to stand up and clap right now.
We're geeking out here. Just don't pay attention to us. Okay, to get back, this will be our last question. This is from Quinn Hurley, who is our intern. He's quite a big fan of yours. He said, if you were to do another addiction story today, would you have the art be grittier? For example, would the needle be in Speedy's arm? Because we've seen television get grittier over time, and movies get grittier.
And video games.
And video games. Would you have kind of a more realistic, grittier art look to this, if it were today?
No, because we wanted it to be as real. The story needed to be as real as possible. I can't think of another comic book artist who did realer looking heroes. The needle, by the way, the needle in the arm is, I think, what we had to change. So it's 2 inches from the arm, I think, in the way the panel was finally printed. But it's not a place for artistic experimentation. That kind of story has to be as real as you can make it. Neil once told me that if Batman really existed, he'd have to look the way I drew him. And I agree with that, the way Neil drew him, not me.
Yeah.
I thought that was one of the strengths. That and the fact that Neil never skimped on place. That's a very mild criticism I have of a lot of comics I see. Is this a city? Is this a house? Is this a room? They're interested in the figures. Well, read Dickens, read Hardy, read Rex Stout. Locale is a narrative tool. Mm-hmm. It's very important to me that I know where something is taking place. Eisner was a master of doing it minimally in the spirit and in great detail later on. They're both right. Mm-hmm. Neil would always give you enough of an establishing shot so you know this is street in Brooklyn with brownstones. And once you know that, you can kind of forget about it. So Neil did those things which maybe not all artists would do, and every bit of what he did served the narrative. And that's what comic book art is there for, to serve the narrative.
Absolutely. Before we go, is there anything that you'd like to add about what people should be looking for in your books, or anything you are doing now that you'd like to promote?
Like a friend of mine who goes online and runs the chat rooms devoted to his work. No. Look, I am an American writer who has worked for 50 years in comic books. At its worst, it was no worse than any other. Well, at its worst, it was a hell of a lot better than working in the bottle factory that I did in college. And at its best, it was just the best damn job I could have imagined. It became that. The last 15 years, I told Paul Levitz, I should have been paying you guys. It was a joy to go into work in the morning. But if we have a message, we didn't conceal it. It's there. And what we were trying to do was tell you a story. That's a noble enough thing to want to do. Tell you a story.
And you did a fantastic job at that.
Yes, you did. And thank you so much for being our guinea pig here. And this has been a real honor for Jason and myself.
Oh, yeah.
We're huge fans, and we really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us, and all of the wonderful students that we have.
Our pleasure, or my pleasure, Christy and Jason, and all those students.
Okay.
As we 60s hippies say, namaste.
Namaste. Well, namaste. Well, thank you so much. And students, you can, if you'd like to view this interview again, it will be up on YouTube shortly. I will post the link on the interview page. And if you are so inclined, there is another MOOC starting on Sunday, I believe it's Sunday, that our friend and our savior tonight, Patrick Urich, as Denny will let us will confirm. He's starting a Making Comics MOOC. So if you go to makingcomics.com, you can look into that. It's a 4-week course, and you can sign up.
Extremely talented guy.
Yes,
Patrick.
and you can learn how to make comics. You can learn how to draw them, put them all together. It's an amazing course. So let's say goodnight to Denny, and thank you so much for being with us. And you can all join us again for our next live interview with Donnie Cates on
Buzzkill.
April 7th, and it will be in the morning at 10 a.m. We changed Denny's because he's a night owl.
Okay, I will try to be up for that interview. As long as I don't have to say anything, I can probably manage to sit here.
All right. Thank you so much, Denny, and
Sure.
we look forward to seeing you in New York.
Yeah. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.